Europe is not just facing a war in Ukraine. Europe is not just threatened by Russia. Europe faces the biggest threat of an immediate nature, not from external powers. It's not as if Russia is going to invade all of Europe anytime soon. But Europe does face the threat of widespread social unrest because the people of Europe are not happy with how things are playing out. Almost every country of Europe is facing protests of some nature. And there's a common thread binding all these protests together. It's their covert pro-Russia nature. Recently, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Italy. Their demand was simple. The government needs to stop giving Ukraine financial and military aid. On Wednesday, thousands of protesters also demonstrated in Greece and Belgium. Workers from both the public and private sector refused to work, affecting the functioning of schools, hospitals, and transportation facilities. In Greece, protests turned violent as agitators used Molotov cocktails and stones against police officials. What are the protesters demanding? For the government to control the escalating costs of living, to tame inflation, and to ensure that taxpayer money is not showered on Ukraine. Romania, Greece, France, the Czech Republic, Italy, the United Kingdom, all these countries are at the receiving end of the citizens' wrath. At the core of all these protests is a mass frustration and annoyance against governments for their unprecedented aid to Ukraine, and an energy crisis triggered by sanctions on Russian oil and gas. For example, the total aid to Ukraine from 40 countries since February 2022 amounts to $84.2 billion. That's a lot of money being spent on Ukraine at a time when recession is looming all over the world. Europe is in the grabs of a multi-pronged crisis simply because Russia and Ukraine are at war with each other. Europe's support for Ukraine and its sanctions on Russia led Putin to shut the gas taps off for European nations. That led to energy costs escalating, fueling inflation, which now seems almost insurmountable. Sky-high inflation has made costs rise across sectors, so much so that people can no longer afford basic necessities with their existing salaries. The governments across Europe seem more concerned about Ukraine's war effort than they are about getting their own economies and energy sectors back on track. Factories are shutting down, industrial activity is taking a massive hit, and Europeans are facing the prospect of getting fired from their jobs. That is fueling anger among people. What are they taking such a beating for? Certainly, they don't seem so keen to suffer because their countries need to support Ukraine or antagonize Russia with sanctions. For Europeans, life was pretty normal until Russian gas kept flowing. As soon as Moscow turned off the taps, people found themselves in the middle of a crisis. Then, Russia said gas supplies could resume immediately if Europe withdrew the sanctions. European nations refused that demand. Essentially, they rejected an easy way out of the crisis, and the people saw this happening in broad daylight. Now, Ukraine is becoming a symbol of European suffering. People want financial and military aid to Ukraine to stop in the hope that Russia would resume gas supplies to the continent. Essentially, the ongoing protests serve Russian interests. It is hard to acknowledge this publicly, but the protests are becoming an outlet for people to express their frustration regarding their country's support for Ukraine at a self-destructing cost. Do you see these protests gaining more momentum?